Bob's humor, I actually want to begin with that book because a comment that I heard about that book from a lovely student who works with us is actually part of the reason why we came up with the idea for this series. The book deals with slavery in an earlier time period in Europe, and this young woman, a young African-American woman, told me after she looked at the book, you know, it helps me to understand the universality of the African-American experience. And I thought, this is the reason why so many great theorists, anthropologists, and writers remind us that we continue to read mythology. We continue to love mythology. Because mythology tells us something about ourselves, because there is something in these stories which are thousands of years old, which speak to us and speak to us very, very powerfully. And that is why you're all here tonight, and we're going to be talking about stories that come from very, very long ago, but have not lost any of their human resonance. And they continue to captivate us. They captivate us because they definitely do explain part of what I will call the human tradition. Now, as Bob told you, I specialize in Latin America, so you might be wondering, what is this Celtic Norse thing? So, apart from my formal specialization, which definitely is in Latin America and the mythology of the native peoples of Latin America, I have some other kind of passions, and one of them, some of you already know, is everything Irish. And so Irish mythology, and of course Welsh mythology, its cousin, crept in because of a very strong presence of the Irish in the New World. Some of you may know, as outcasts, as leaders, as pirates, and as part of the reason that Latin America is independent. And the Norse, how did they come into that? Well, when I was going through my training as an anthropologist in Argentina and Peru many years ago, you may know, you may not know, that the greatest anthropologists of Latin America were all Scandinavian. Do any of you know that? Are any of you old enough to remember something called Kon-Tiki? Very good-looking Norwegian man who took a ship, right? He made the ship with the aid of the Indians of Peru and showed that the ship that the native peoples of Peru used could sail from Peru all the way across the Pacific. Do you remember his name? Thor Heyerdahl. Very good. Okay, very good. So I was training with them for many, many years. And I have a very beautiful memory of many long nights up in Peru where it freezes. Please don't think Latin America is always a tropical paradise. It gets very cold. And we would trade stories of mythology. And the Norse cycles of mythology, as Thor Heyerdahl and Carl Lumholtz and a whole slew of very important Scandinavian, principally Norwegian, but also from other countries, anthropologists showed us many years ago, Norse mythology is actually much more similar to Native American mythology than to other European mythologies. Okay? And the same goes double, I would say, for the Celtic mythologies. So before we actually start the lecture and go into this PowerPoint made for us by my lovely friend and colleague, Kendra Brunig, who's there in the back, you will, after this lecture, jump on Kendra and Angela, our business specialist. They will be by that table, and you please jump on them after the lecture, physically, and get all the information on our wonderful center that Professor Björk has just introduced to you. Before we actually start the lecture with the PowerPoint, I will remind you of a very brilliant admonition Thor Heyerdahl gave to all of his students back in the 50s. I was studying with people who were already the sons and daughters of his students. But his influence was very, very strong. It was very, very strong on me. And he said, whenever you read the mythology of any people, remember one thing. What you call mythology is religion. You're calling it mythology because it's not your religion. But your religion is someone else's mythology. That's one thing Heyerdahl asked you to do. The second thing Heyerdahl asks you to do is when you approach another culture, and we're going to approach 3 other cultures right now. The pagan Irish, the pagan Welsh, and the pagan Norse. And you're going to hear me during the entire lecture comparing it constantly to things in Native American folklore. The thing Heyerdahl asks us to do is to start what he called a messy dialogue. This wonderful messy dialogue between peoples in which we do not need to come to a consensus, about what the meaning of life is, or what the creator or creators are, however you want to look at it. But the dialogue, Heyerdahl reminded us, is much better than the alternative. The alternative is unthinkable. Okay? And I think we all understand what he means by that. So if you haven't heard of Thor Heyerdahl, go back and well, now you can get this online. Look up his book Kon-Tiki, which is named after a very important god of one of the Indian peoples of Latin America. We're going to be dealing with that in another workshop. Actually, I think that's our April workshop here in Gilbert. But for the time being, you should get used to me mentioning Thor Heyerdahl, because part of the idea behind this series definitely comes from the training that I had with the people who studied under him. And thankfully, our wonderful center here in Arizona, which Bob has been directing for the past 21, nearly 22 years, has a very global outlook, and so we are going to begin already mixing many cultures. Okay, so thank you to all of you. And now let's start. Well, we're going to start even with this first picture. Kendra has taught me how to point the PowerPoint pointer at the computer, which is good because my technical skills are from the time of the ancient North. So let's start with historical origins. And let's start with maps. Something else Kendra always points out to me is that it is a good idea to locate my lectures on maps. Because, and that's true, because I tend to run all over the place. So let's start with the historical origins of the Celts. When I say the word Celtic, many of you probably think of what, Wales, Ireland, the Isle of Man, Scotland, yeah? And then some of you could think of the Celts in the New World, where many Irish slaves and rebels ended up, particularly in the Caribbean, right? We know as buccaneers and pirates, and in Latin America later as freedom fighters. But how many of you think of the term Hallstatt? Okay, so folks, the Celts, like many of the peoples of Europe, are what we call Indo-European. Originally they come out of a great migration which begins slowly about 12,000 years ago out of the steppes of Central Asia. The place where what we call Celtic culture first originates is a salt mine in Austria, and that's Hallstatt. And so when you're looking for the origins of Celtic culture, you have to go back a little farther than Ireland and Wales, and you have to go back about 5,000 years to the salt mines of Hallstatt. There are many, many places in between. And now you understand where Austria comes in. Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. I mentioned the salt mines. Why would salt be important? Why would the Celts have prized salt more than gold? You know, Julius Caesar was very down on the Celts. Do you know that? Julius Caesar never liked the Celts. Well, Julius Caesar didn't like a lot of people. He didn't like the Jews, he didn't like the Armenians, he didn't like the Celts, he didn't like anybody. And we know that in the end, some people didn't like him either. So, get too brutal. But why would the Celts, the people that Caesar frowned on because he said they fight in a disorganized way? Yeah? They were not regimented like the Roman troops. And he said they do not know how to prize good metals. Yeah, that's very interesting because the Spanish conquistadors made the same complaint about many of the native peoples of the New World, that they liked gold just for pretty things, but they didn't value it as such. Why would the Celts have prized salt above gold? Can somebody tell me? It's very much needed, and
it was used to preserve food.
Food! You cannot eat gold. So you would need salt far more than gold. And the Celts, who Julius Caesar claimed were horribly disorganized and didn't know how to fight, understood that you could not swallow gold. Salt, which is what they traded, and the horses, which is how they traded it, become the two most important images in their culture. In Austria, in that area around what is now Hallstatt, and you can visit that archaeological site, it's a very, very interesting one, and it is open to the public. They will go out from Austria towards first what you see in northern Spain. Did you know there's a Celtic part of northern Spain? Okay, called Galicia, where they play bagpipes. And they tell the stories of Cuchulainn, pero lo contamos en español. And they emigrate from Galicia. There's a place in Galicia called Finisterre, World's End, literally. and they emigrate from Finisterre first to Brittany. Do you see that little part? Right? That is emphasized for you in France. And from Brittany, they split. And one part, the older part, goes to Wales. Do you see Wales? So the type of Breton, the type of language related to Irish Gaelic, but not the same. Welsh and Irish are closely related, but they are definitely two different languages. The Welsh variant is older. Okay, and what Julius Caesar would have heard, or well, not Caesar himself, but what his men would have heard when they invaded Britain was something closer to what the Welsh speak. Closer to what the Welsh speak than closer to what you would find today in an Irish Gaeltacht, which are the areas where Irish Gaelic continues to be spoken. Ireland. Ireland completely covered. Ireland becomes the only island in whose entirety the Celts will settle, not in one emigration, but in 5 different waves. And Scotland, what we now call Scotland, which, like Wales, will have constant wars back and forth with the Irish. Now, I point this out because before I actually put my lectures together, I tend to have long and interesting conversations with Angela and Kendra, who are 2 wonderful colleagues of mine. And before we put the PowerPoints together, and before Kendra actually takes the pictures, we talk about issues. And one interesting thing I was talking about with my colleague Angela was the fact that so much of what we call Celtic and Norse mythology today is not Celtic and Norse mythology. It was rewritten for you in the 19th century. And there will be concepts in there that really have nothing to do with the stories that we're going to hear tonight. One of those concepts you have to get out of your head if you're really going to look at both Celtic and Norse mythology is this idea that there was Celtic unity or Norse unity, because that absolutely did not exist. It absolutely did not exist. And you're not going to understand these stories if you have that kind of overly romantic notion in your head. Have any of you ever heard of the term Celtic Twilight? Okay, this is actually a form of art, very influenced by pre-Raphaelite art, which gets going in Ireland and England in the end of the 19th century, and paints a very misty, pretty view of everything Celtic. That was not the reality. Okay, so please understand that although these people were related in terms of culture and religion, and epics, and what we would call myth, but what Thor Heyerdahl reminds us is religion, they also fought each other. Same thing for the Norse. Okay, let's take a look at Scandinavia. Now, putting something in here automatically because I hope you haven't encountered this, but sometimes when you look at Norse mythology, you will encounter this by people who don't know Norse mythology but are using it for rather strange purposes. So let's confront this. I had a very interesting conversation with Angela, and I have another very interesting conversation with Kendra. We were talking about this issue of Norse mythology sometimes being perverted by white supremacist groups, right? The images of Norse mythology being used for that, which is really quite ridiculous, and I'm not saying this lightly, folks, because I'm Jewish, okay? So you know where this is going. And let me explain where it's going, because if we look at the historical record of the Norse, I find them in 2 Jewish sources. You weren't expecting that. Okay? I'm a Sephardic Jew, so this question is going to resound in me. If there's anything anti-Semitic, I'm going to find it. But the fact is the historical Norse had not one drop of anti-Semitism, and the 2 times they're actually mentioned in Jewish sources, and this, I'm going to get on to why their makeup includes, the DNA makeup includes people from very far away. One is in the 12th century, when the Norse had actually, by that point, become Christian. And Harald Hardrada, a very important king of Norway, was kind of cleaning out Sicily, and there's a small Jewish community in Sicily, which according to our sources, to the Sephardic Jewish sources, Sephardic, by the way, meaning of Spanish origin, okay? The ones who were there before the Inquisition told us to go rather forcefully in 1492. Harald Hardrada treated that Jewish community very well. In fact, not only did he treat them well, but he actually gave them new land to live on. There's a very pleasant mention of Harald Hardrada. But now let's go back to when the Norse were pagans, and suddenly I find a wonderful mention of the Vikings and the Jews in a Christian source called the Annals of Saint Bertin. Anybody looking that up? You can actually even Google it, Bertin. Okay, the Annals of Saint Bertin. It's from the 9th century, and this tells of the Norse invasion of the town of Bordeaux in 847, and how, listen closely, the Vikings and the Hebrews, that's us, joined together to fight the tyrant William of Septimania so that the good King Charles the Bold could come back. So I got rather curious at this one, and I took a look at some Jewish sources from the time, and lo and behold, yes, they had quite a bit of trade with the men of the North, as they call them. And mentions of the men of the North were entirely positive. The Norse were not into converting the Jews, as we know was a constant obsession in the rest of Europe. Well, if you already believe in 947 gods, believing in another one is not going to make a problem for you. And the only slightly negative things that the Hebrew Chronicles say about the people of the North is that they drank a lot. But that's as bad as it gets. So I'm saying this because you probably know that a lot of Norse symbols have been misappropriated by white supremacist groups. But just to make this point clear, there is no racial unity among people of the Northlands. As Thor Heyerdahl pointed out long ago, the Vikings got everywhere, including the New World, you know that, right? You know they got to Anso Meadows up there in Canada, and their DNA includes Mediterranean, because the Vikings were in the Mediterranean a lot. In Andalusia, in Italy, Native American DNA. The University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona has even found up to 4% Native American DNA in Iceland. Both male and female, so you have Norse women who also like Native American men. There you go. And a lot of Central Asian as well, so you're not talking about this kind of warped idea of a master race that has nothing to do with original Norse mythology, and I just want to make that point very clear. Because that idea comes from something very misappropriated in the 19th century. And as I've spoken many times about with Kendra there in the back, Valkyries did not have horns. That was Wagner's nonsense. And that, again, I give you this long introduction because now when we get into the actual myths, you will have a better idea of where we're going. So, of course, you know the Vikings came from Scandinavia. They were, as all anthropologists have pointed out, particularly the Scandinavian ones, an ethnically very heterogeneous group. And you're not going to find them being any more or less savage than any other group in Europe at the time. And if I can kind of add an almost pro-Viking sentiment, let me say that when you were talking about groups such as the Jews and the Native Americans, who have been the victim constantly of fairly ugly persecution, it's interesting to note that in both Jewish and Native American accounts, the Norse, the few times they appear, are spoken about quite well. Except for the drinking problem, but everything else. Celts, Gaels and Britons. We could deal with Brittany, we could deal with Scotland, but I'm going to stick to Ireland and Wales here, because I know them best. And because it ties in a bit more with what I want to do with you, which is to focus on the universal meanings of the mythology. So let's look at Bridget. Now you see Bridget, the goddess Bridget, with her red hair. And she is kind of a synthesis of what we call syncretism. How many of you have ever heard of that word? Syncretism means, in anthropology, a coming together of different religions, different beliefs. Some are polytheistic, meaning believing in many gods. Some are biblical. We're going to get to her Welsh version in a minute, or I could rather say Bridget is the Irish version of the Welsh Llyddwyd. I'm sure I just mispronounced her name. And then we're going to look at the two of them in relation to hell. So after this lecture, you may never again tell somebody to go to hell. Because hell really wasn't so bad, and that's the Norse version. So who is Bridget? Images of Bridget go back actually to Hallstatt in Austria. She is one of the Celts, and of the particular branch of the Celts who go to Ireland, to Erin, as it is called. She is the goddess of fire. She's the goddess of the hearth, hence her red hair. Notice her red hair, because every image in that iconography is important. The Irish began to write down their magnificent epics basically after they became Christian. And that's already after Patrick, the very beginning of the 5th century into the 6th century. But before that, the epics were spoken. And so every element of the iconography has to mean something. The red hair symbolizes fire. Bridget has 2 parts to her. She is benevolent, she's the goddess of the hearth, she's the mother goddess, but she is also a warrior goddess. And here you're going to see one of the themes that ties together the women in the Irish, the Welsh, and the Norse visions of the cosmos. They are warrior women. That should also destroy for you a rather silly stereotype we have of the Middle Ages. Well, this comes also from the 19th century and then creeps into Hollywood and never creeps out. Of the woman just, waiting to be rescued. No. Because, you know, as a wonderful historian of the Middle Ages by the name of Jacques Le Goff has pointed out, to survive those times, in particular to survive those times into the early modern period, when armies, just as a matter of course, would basically rape the women, their own women. When they returned, you had to fight. So don't be surprised that more of the women fight. Now the Irish also have a very interesting story in a book called Lawer Gebala Erin, which means the Book of the Taking of Ireland, that claim that the Irish stayed for a while with the Jews in Egypt and actually went out with them during the Exodus. So it was the Irish in the Red Sea. That's what they say. And Bridget, in the Irish Chronicles, once they begin to be written down, is frequently compared to the Old Testament prophetess Deborah. And if you know the story of Devorah, as we call her in Hebrew, she's the one who forces Barak into battle when he's kind of sniveling and saying, I don't want to go. And it's basically Deborah who leads him. Bridget leads the people of Danann. Now remember that, because we're going to talk about the Tuatha de Danann, the people of the goddess Danann. So she is a goddess of the home, and she is a goddess of war. And when Ireland becomes Christian peacefully, actually the only country in the world to have become Christian peacefully, there's a credit to St. Patrick because that process was not repeated peacefully in any other place, she becomes one of the most important of the Irish saints, St. Bridget, who together with St. Patrick has never been officially canonized by the Church. But as Conor Cruz O'Brien, a great Irish writer, said 30 years ago, well, we can tell the Vatican a thing or two anyways. There you go. Now, there is a story of somebody rather similar to Bridget, but also rather different to her, in the Welsh Chronicles. And when I say the Welsh Chronicles now, I'm referring to one particular collection, which is the oldest of many collections that we have from Wales, and this is called the Mabinogeon. Many of you will have heard of the word Mabinogeon. Many of you will not know that the Mabinogeon was actually translated from Welsh into English by a very important of her time, Welsh scholar, but she was English herself, Lady Margaret Guest. And Lady Margaret Guest was particularly interested in this character of Lodowedd, and my apologies for all the Welsh I'm massacring, the flower woman, because as Lady Margaret Guest, again, the 19th century translator of the Mabinogeon, pointed out, the heroines in the Welsh stories of King Arthur, so you know, of course, I have to mention King Arthur, who is probably the most famous of all of the Celtic heroes come gods. In the Welsh stories, they're not what they are in the later medieval English and French stories, where the women are kind of wilting violets, what is it in English? Shrieking violence. Well, they're also wilted. In the Welsh stories, the women are strong and the women are kind of nasty. So who was Blodeuwedd? She was made out of flowers for the god of light, and his name was Lu. Now that's interesting because, you know, in Spanish, how do we say light? Luz, right? And of course you have the term in Latin. And if you go to Ireland, right, the cousins of the Welsh, you see the plain of Lunasa in the west of Ireland, which by the way has the well of St. Bridget where little dolls are thrown down representing earlier sacrifices. So this was a widely worshipped god, but Lu, in the Welsh stories, the god of light had a curse upon him, and that was that he could not marry a woman who was of this world. That curse was put upon him by his mother. Ui, what would Sigmund Freud have said? You're staying with me forever. So pity Freud never analyzed either Celtic mythology or Norse mythology. Well, he analyzed, but he did well enough. But this would be something that I think he would have had quite a bit of fun with, because Lu's mother does not want to give him up, but Lu's father then creates, together with a very important druid. The druid, by the way, if you've heard the term druid, you might think of somebody very similar to Old Testament prophets, right? They kind of are prophets. These were the advisors to the kings. And the term druid comes from an earlier term, a now extinct term in Welsh, which means to know, all right? Knowing, knowledge. There's another term later, to ken, which is to know, which kind of replaces the first term, but that's where it comes from. So they make a woman out of flowers. You see, she's not of this world. So Lu marries her, but then Blodeuwedd, the woman of flowers, falls in love with the god of darkness. Now remember, Lu is the god of light. She falls in love with the god of darkness. And the theme here in a lot of Celtic mythology is resolving what we call duality, because we all have darkness and light. There is this constant idea, which I would say is a more mature idea than what we'll find maybe later on, that some people are good and some people are bad. Some people are both. They're everywhere. By the way, you'll find this in Norse mythology. You're going to find this as soon as we talk about hell in a minute. And it's something that makes these mythologies, I think, a bit more psychologically mature than this idea that a person can be either all good or all bad. So just so you know, in the Welsh mythology, Lu is actually divided into two people. He's both the god of darkness and the god of light. So isn't that interesting that Blodeuwedd falls in love with one aspect of it, but not another? Well, think of some people you've dated. You know? Right? So, there's an adulterous affair, and Lu is literally split in two, because he is. And then the part of Lu that is light pursues Blodeuwedd, who flees from him, and their flight is chronicled for you in the Milky Way. Okay, so next time you look up on a summer night and you can see the Milky Way, the stars are actually Lu pursuing the flower woman, Blodeuwedd, across the sky. And it's one of the most important aspects of mythology. It explains the natural world to us. Blodeuwedd begins to be pictured much as Bridget is pictured in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Remember, these stories are very, very early stories. As a warrior woman, she fights Lu, but she's in love with him, one of these love-hate relationships. So we are talking about stories of human beings in symbolic terms. And I think what's interesting, and this is something that the Norwegian anthropologist Carl Lumholtz pointed out, is that when we look at the mythology of the Celts, the Norse, and the Native Americans, we see that there is this constant emphasis on duality because there is a belief that no one is entirely good or entirely evil. Now contrast that with the medieval fairy tales that you know, right? Where they're all good or all bad. And now go back into an earlier time, the time we erroneously called the Dark Ages, and you might start to see a bit more psychological sophistication than what you see later. And now, when was the last time somebody told you to go to hell? Well, they didn't know what they were saying. There's a character in Norse mythology who has his parallel, his perfect parallel only in Native American mythology. And that's the character of the trickster. Here in the Southwest, we know of him as Coyote. And in Norse mythology, of course, it's the god Loki. And the trickster has a purpose in the cosmology because you need someone to create chaos. Does that sound crazy? You do need a certain amount of chaos to find your own odyssey and your own way. And Loki has a daughter named Hel. And what I want you to remember about Hel is that, like Bridget and Blodeuwedd, she is a warrior woman. Unlike Bridget and Blodeuwedd, she has a much harder time finding someone to fall in love with her. By the way, if you're wondering what Bridget does, she's supposed to have amorous relationships with all the gods. So she settles down with none, but she has a good time. And Blodeuwedd, of course, has that endless love-hate relationship with Lu, the god of light and darkness. But Hel has been cursed by her family. She wouldn't be the first. Right? So half of her is a beautiful woman, and the other half is a rotting corpse. And this is the curse that Loki has put on her. And so she becomes associated with the realm of the dead. But here's something interesting, which Thor Heyerdahl pointed out. She's very parallel to another character we'll talk about in another episode of our series here, from Mayan mythology, named Ishkik, who also is a daughter of the prince of the underworld. But Hel, like Ishkik, you'll see later, has her own mind. And so Hel does not do what Loki wants her to do, which is basically to terrify the souls who come into her realm, who are not great warriors. You know where the great warriors go? What's that called? Valhalla. Okay, but the average schmo does not go to Valhalla. So the average schmo goes to hell, literally. But Hel is what is so interesting in these stories. Hel treats them with kindness and with love. So even though she herself was quote-unquote cursed by Loki to belong to neither life nor death, at the end of the day, she kind of ends up encompassing both. So we begin with a character of women here, and this is also something which unites all of the, well, I won't say all of the Celtic mythologies, because that's actually not true about Scottish and Breton mythology. It unites Welsh, Irish, and Norse mythology, very strong female figures. We have something else that unites the mythologies. And the first time I heard this in a really rainy cabin, a freezing night during a Peruvian winter with a Norwegian colleague of mine and his girlfriend Lorna. And I remember saying to Lorna, "Are you sure that's a Norse story? I think that story is Jewish, because we call that in Hebrew, Eitz Chaim. That's the tree of life." And Lorna said to me quite wisely, "My dear, it's in many cultures." So the world tree. Very, very important image when you read the Welsh Mabinogeon. The world tree is everywhere, and the first time it appears is when the Prince Pwyll accidentally goes to hell. Everybody's always accidentally going to hell. Oh, whoops, damn, where am I? Oh, the underworld. Oh, whoops. And at the entry to the underworld, Prince Pwyll sees a tree that is half black and half white, with birds rising and falling, and without any fear, understands that he is on the border between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Now, to the Celts, to the Norse, and also to the Native Americans, the world of the dead was not a place of horror. Please get out of your minds Night of the Living Dead and all this rubbish on HBO. It was a world that coexisted with yours, where the spirits simply lived alongside of you. There's nothing to be frightened of. The Yggdrasil, and I'm sure I just massacred that, but that is probably the oldest source of this in Northern Europe. Now again, I know of this from Jewish traditions, like, oh, but it's got to be older. I think I would say with Carl Lumholtz, I'm going to constantly keep on quoting these two anthropologists, Thor Heyerdahl and Carl Lumholtz. These are universal ideas that people come to, okay? A tree as a sign of life. Why? Because a tree unifies three levels. Have you ever noticed that about a tree? underworld where the roots are, your world where the trunk is, or the middle world as the Norse call it, and as the Mayan Indians call it, the middle world, and the heavens. Okay, so it's this idea of a being, a living being that unifies all the parts of existence. The world tree is also the tree on which the Norse god, the great god Woden, actually hangs himself. Woden, to a certain degree, will sacrifice himself for humanity. He loses one of his eyes, do you know that? In order to gain wisdom. So the tree represents life and martyrdom and rebirth. And in Norse mythology, its roots are always being gnawed by a dragon. Now, it's very easy, and it would be a little wrong of me to say, oh, so the Norse are just very, very fatalistic. I would have said that 20 years ago when I was younger and a little stupider. But the more that I began to compare Norse mythology with Native American religion and cosmology, I began to see something a little bit similar with the Mayan Indians, in whose culture I'm specialized. And that is that although the Norse did believe that, some of those gods were really mean, as the Mayan Indians believed as well, they also had an escape route. And the escape route came in the form of really intelligent little animals. And one of them was a squirrel. For the Mayan Indians, it'll be a rabbit. And for the Norse, it'll be a squirrel. And despite the fact that there's a big nasty dragon gnawing the roots of the tree, the Midgard serpent, the serpent of the middle world, he and his friends, the other dragons, have a lot of problems because of this one really gutsy little squirrel that creates problems for all of the underworld or middle world serpents. That's a very interesting idea because it's not a belief that the universe is always benevolent. It's not. But it is a belief that you can begin, to a certain degree, to rebel against the gods if you need to. Okay, now that idea may be very shocking to all of us. I'm assuming many of us, like myself, belong to a monotheistic religion, and this is a dilemma. Do you know the English writer Archibald MacNeish said, if God is God, he is not good. If God is good, he is not God. Think about that. We believe in an all-powerful God, and horrible things happen. How do I justify that? Well, that's a dilemma I have to deal with, because I am a believing monotheist. But I completely understand and respect another point of view, which is what we would call a monotheistic point of view, saying, well, there are some gods who are good and some who are bad. What's interesting is that both the Norse and the Celts at one point stopped submitting to the evil gods, and there is more of a feeling that, well, you can also rebel against them. To a certain degree, Thor is very beloved in Norse mythology because he really does try to protect these poor human beings from all of these really nasty, otherworldly forces which are constantly threatening to undo them. Now, if you go to much older, the oldest mythologies that we know of in Central Asia, there are stories of a gigantic tree that binds the upper, the middle, and the lower levels of existence, in which the bards are born. Oh, and now this connects with the Irish and the Welsh. How many of you have heard the term the bard? Right? And there were Norse bards as well, right? So the poet, the seer, in Central Asian mythology, is born on the branches of the world tree. And so there is this idea that it is the shaman, the one who heals, who can create the greatest type of poetry, because poetry's purpose is to heal you. And of course it is the site of Woden's tragedy. A very great filmmaker from Sweden, who I hope you've heard of. Have you ever seen this film, The Seventh Seal, or The Virgin Spring? Who am I talking about? Ingmar Bergman. So I once told a student, I remember asking a student of that question, he said, yeah, I saw him. He acted in that amazing film with Humphrey Bogart. No, that's a grip. Like Humphrey Bogart was not hugging and kissing Ingmar Bergman. Like I could not quite imagine that. They're both Swedish, but they were two different people. One thing that Ingmar Bergman pointed out is that in the, let me not say the cult of Woden, because it was a religion as much as our religions are religions to us. In the religion of Woden, as as he was filming his movie The Virgin Spring, and if you haven't seen that, please see it. It's a rather amazing study of the not-so-happy coexistence between the Old Norse religion and Christianity in medieval Scandinavia. Ingmar Bergman pointed out that the tree ends up having a very dual meaning for those Scandinavians who were kind of living that transition period between the Norse religion into Christianity. Because the tree, of course, for many early Christians, had a strong association with the wood of the cross. Jesus' martyrdom. And for anybody who still followed the Norse religion at that point, Woden's martyrdom. Because the Yggdrasil in Norse mythology has 9 levels. There are 9 different worlds. So when you hang yourself on that tree to suffer for the plight of humanity, that is also a real martyrdom. So it's very interesting to think, how would the early Norse have actually seen the image of the cross? Would they have looked at the cross and seen the world tree? Now I want you to do some thinking. If you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim, and I'm assuming probably the majority of people here are, if you're not, just lay back and chuckle. But if you belong to any one of those 3 Abrahamic faiths that I just mentioned, you tell me what image in the Bible this is going to summon up to you. A serpent hanging from a tree. Okay. Right, for me, that would be every image I saw in my Hebrew school in Argentina. How do you think the Norse saw the Midgard serpent circling the universe? Okay, that same image was there in the minds of the early Norse. So these are prototypical images, and when they turn up again in Welsh mythology, and they go from, well, we call it Welsh religion, and they go from Welsh religion to Irish religion, this idea of the great tree divided in 2, dividing the worlds of the living and the dead, but uniting them, is what we call a universal archetype. And I would tend to use that explanation, which is Lumhol's explanation, which is Heyerdahl's explanation, more than kind of fantastic ideas of, okay, the Norse brought this to the Native Americans, and the Native Americans brought this to the Germans, and the Germans brought it to the Jews, and the Jews brought it to the extraterrestrials, and then we're with that man with the funny hair on the History Channel. So the northern goddesses, when we talk about the women in these epics, we talk about the invasions of Ireland and Wales, and we talk about the women of the Norse stories, like the goddess Freya, who is often wrongly referred to only as the Norse Venus. She definitely is a goddess of love and fertility, but you know, if you've ever seen images of Freya, she also has a dagger, and she also has a sword. She is also a warrior. And these shared archetypes make these women very, very different from archetypes you will find in the later literature of Europe and in what we would call the High Middle Ages. These women do not wait to be rescued. These women lead armies. So one of the invasions of Ireland, one of the 5 Celtic invasions, is led by the goddess Danan. And that is the invasion of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danan. Danan is the goddess of the spring equinox. All right, there she is. Look at, well, you know, Kendra and I have a nasty habit of kind of taking pictures and saying, well, that's the goddess Danan, and that's the goddess Freya, and that's kind of all of them. But it's a very good archetype that Kendra has for us here. And that could be Danan. And Danan is the goddess of Beltane. Anybody ever hear of that? Beltane is a very, very good, very, very important Celtic, primarily celebrated in Ireland and Wales, holiday which focused on the equinox as a sign of equilibrium and harmony. Remember, these are cultures that are very tied to nature and in rhythm with nature. And what will wrongly be termed paganism or idolatry by people who really, I don't think, cared about studying what the faiths were, is more of this closeness to the spirits of nature. Nature is not always nice. Nature can be cruel. And so the warrior aspect is there for women as it is for men. Okay, so the goddess Danan, the goddess of the spring equinox, also leads her people to battle. And if you go back into the original stories in the Mabinogeon, you will find that the important woman in those books is not Gwenwyfar, who becomes later who? Guinevere. And by the way, there is no Sir Lancelot in the Mabinogeon. That's an invention of the French writer Chrétien de Troyes in the late 12th century. Lancelot's not floating around there. In fact, in the Welsh stories, the one who is committing adultery is not the woman, it's Arthur. Ooh, there goes, boy, last time I see Lerner and Lowe's Camelot, right? They didn't get that right. And again, you have to watch out with taking the 19th century version of these stories as the original stories. It's Arthur. Arthur Arcturus, right? And named after the bear constellation. Among the Welsh, as among many of the Native American peoples, the king had to incarnate the qualities of the bear, of the mother bear. Why of the mother bear? Anybody ever look at a bear? Tell me why the mother bear. What will the mother bear not do to defend its young? Okay, so this is the idea of a king or a queen who will defend his or her people. And Arthur commits, well, he defends his people, but he also commits adultery twice. One time not knowing it, and one time definitely knowing it. And the time he knew it is with a woman named Leonors. And Leonors is the woman in the Mabinogeon who has that rather strange prophecy. You will be born a commoner, you will die a queen, but you will be uncrowned forever. And Arthur has illegitimate children with Leonors, which, by the way, for the time would have been fairly typical for a 5th century Celtic warrior. Who's the other one? And she's much more important in the story than Gwenwyfar. Who's his problematic half-sister? Morgana. Morgana Le Fay, as she will be called in French, or Morrigu, as she was called in Welsh, is actually not just one woman, but 3. Because, of course, she is based on the goddess of death. But again, the goddess of death is not such an evil goddess. This is more in keeping with Loki's daughter, Hel, or what we would call the angel of death in the Bible. The one who simply has to come and do the hard work, but it will take the soul off to eternal life and consolation. Morgana, as she is known to us, is Arthur's half-sister. Arthur has a child with her. What's that child? Mordred. Is there a biblical resonance in that? Could that be reminding you of one particular king among the ancient Israelites who also had an adulterous affair with a woman who bathed on the roof? Bathsheba. What's the king? David. And what happens with the son they have? Absalom. He rebels against David. And David kills him. Now look back at the Arthurian story. Okay? So the same way Arthur will have to kill Mordred, because Mordred must be killed because he comes from an unjust union, you have the same idea in the Old Testament. By the way, something interesting, and I have no idea if there's any connection, I will just let you know that in the Talmud, the post-biblical Jewish commentaries on the Old Testament, King David is described as having red hair. I do not know if that makes him Irish or Welsh. But he is described as having red hair. Not in the Bible, in the Talmud. It's just a little curiosity I have to throw out to you. Okay, animals, shamanism, and the familiar. How many of you have heard the term, the familiar? Okay, we're not talking about somebody from your family. Depends on the relationships you have in your family. The familiar is a character who will look like someone you know, but incarnate. I don't want to use the term diabolical because the Celts and the Norse did not see the world in terms of good and evil, God and the devil. There are energies of light and energies of darkness, and you have to learn how to balance both. And the familiar will be a character who represents the darker energies. That could be somebody who looks like you, or who looks like someone that you know. If you go back to the Arthurian legend, the Queen Igrania thinks that she is making love to her husband, but it's actually Uther Pendragon. And we know who comes out of that. That will be Arthur Pendragon, their son. And Uther is described in early Welsh literature as having the power of a familiar. So we can all have shamanic powers. That was a belief in Celtic culture, it still is. In polytheistic Norse culture, and it is very much a living belief among Native American peoples. You can tap into your shamanism. Whether you tap into the good or the evil side is completely up to you. Have you ever heard the term power animals? You probably heard it, I think, a bit more with Native American thought than with Celtic and Norse thought, but now you'll understand why when the Norse come to the New World, and yes, they did get to the New World, that is archaeologically proven. In northern Canada, in Anso Meadows, and up in Ungava Bay, some of us know. If you don't know that, it's Baffin Island. They were there, and they were there between, beginning of the 11th to the end of the 14th century. And they had a fairly good coexistence with the native peoples. They must have felt very familiar to them, because just like the Iroquois and the Cree people, the Norse and the Celts as well have a belief, I talk as though I'm living in the 7th century, had a belief, some still have, that you could connect with an animal that would incarnate the strength that you needed for a particular purpose. So if you're a man and you need to go to battle, you need to defend your family, you would connect with the power of a jaguar or a mountain lion or something that would have strong masculine energy. If you were a woman and you had to go to battle to protect your family, you would connect with the mother bear and the raven. You know the raven for the native peoples of the the northwest of Canada. Raven is the one who brings fire and wisdom to the peoples of the great northwest, the Kwakiutl Indian peoples. Well, ravens are awfully important in Norse and Celtic mythology, and in fact, if you think of the god Odin, right, he always has two ravens by his side. In some accounts representing thought and memory. Ravens, now you're thinking of Edgar Allan Poe, aren't you? Right? In all of mythology, ravens have a very, very important role, as do all birds, because they straddle the earth and sky. So they're looked at as belonging to more than one world. The unicorn, now we see that with the Irish in particular, and also the Welsh, the horse, and the horse goddess, there she is, Epona, have a very, very strong meaning, because it is through the horse that they will trade. It is through the horse that they will sometimes win in battle, even though, as we know, Julius Caesar said they're very disorganized. What would the unicorn have been? I want you to forget later medieval accounts of this one pretty kind of white horse with a long horn and a red tip, where I think the meaning is more phallic and more obvious. And if you go into earlier stories, into the Welsh and Irish stories, where the unicorn appears, it is a symbol of the union of duality. So it appears together with the world tree that is both black and white. And something very interesting that the Irish say is when the final deal was made between the members of the 5th invasion, the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danann, and the 6th invasion, who they call the Milesians, who are the ancestors of the people you would today call the Irish, the Tuatha De Danann did not die, and the Milesians did not kill them. They just agreed to split up Ireland in a different way. The Milesians would get the Ireland that you see, living Ireland, and Tuatha De Danann, who you later know as the fairies and the wee people, and they would get the invisible dimension of the spirit world, which is no less real. Epona, the horse goddess, is connected with the pull of the tides and the force of the moon. Epona, in all of Irish and Welsh tradition, she's known as Mapona, and now, in fact, in Welsh tradition, she also becomes a man. Or should I say, in Irish tradition, she becomes a woman. Actually, it's in Irish tradition she becomes a woman, because you know that the Welsh is a bit older than the Irish. Why is this associated with the sea and not with the sun? These are not solar peoples. So our friends, the anthropologists, Thor Heyerdahl and Carl Lumholtz, pointed out that when you are dealing with cultures that emphasize aquatic elements and that emphasize night, usually, I don't want to say always, but usually, and I have to say, anthropologically the correspondence is kind of amazing. You are dealing with polytheistic cultures which tend to be much more pro-female and much more tolerant and much less imperial than other cultures. Now you notice I did not say less warlike, because we know the Celts fought like hell and so did the Norse. But in terms of building an empire, that wasn't really, and I know this is a bit controversial what I'm saying regarding the Norse, but the Norse actually were more interested in settling in the area as they did in Ireland, right? Dublin, Dublin, the Black River, is a Norse city built on top of Ballyahaclia, right? The earlier Gaelic city, and they merged with the local people, which is where you get a lot of blonde Irishmen from. They were more interested in settling. There was no organized Norse empire in the Viking period. And the Celts, like the Mayan Indians, were famous for fighting among themselves. So this idea of the night and certain animals associated with the power of the moon, the power of water, has a bit more to do with cultures which de-emphasize imperialism and emphasize the woman. Now, if you think of Roman culture was more of a solar culture. If you think of most imperial cultures, and I can take plenty of modern examples, whenever the force of the sun is emphasized in the ideology, it is usually connected with a type of political imperialism. I'm going to leave that thought with you, and if you want to talk to me about it later, you're welcome to, but I will tell you that what Heyerdahl and Lumholtz said is borne out numerically. So basically what I'm saying is that peoples who are associated with the sea are kind of nicer. That whole thing. Flying serpents. Now we know that's a Native American cosmology, right? Quetzalcoatl, the flying serpent. The dragon, of course. You cannot think of Welsh mythology without thinking of the two dragons, the white and the red, who the child Merlin pointed out were fighting each other for the throne of Britain. Right? Aren't dragons a Welsh thing? Are dragons an Irish thing? Yeah, I know, the Irish got a little bored with dragons, I have to say. Dragons are in Irish mythology, but they're kind of in there just because the bard feels at one point, yeah, let's put in a dragon. But it's not really a central point in Irish mythology, something that makes Irish mythology very different to Welsh. In Welsh mythology, though, they are central. And think of Arthur's lineage, Pendragon. Pen in ancient Welsh meaning the chief, so the dragon chief. But that is a Norse borrowing. Okay? That comes into Celtic culture via the connections with the Norse. What were the connections with the Norse? Well, they weren't so nice. The Norse and the Celts fought each other, but they also intermarried. So while, yeah, they did have many bloody battles, many. In Dublin, the Norse are supposed to have hammered the noses of the Irish who wouldn't pay them taxes. Have you ever heard the phrase paying through the nose? But, you know, we know that the Irish sometimes could also do things that weren't so nice. So they took a young man from Britain who was of Roman, Norse, and British origin. They took him as a slave. Ooh, but he was very important later in Irish history, wasn't he? What's his name? Only St. Patrick. Okay? So there was mutual slave taking. There was mutual slave raiding. I'm not going to romanticize that, but what you don't have is extermination. That type of thing will wait for the early modern period and the modern period to get going. So the flying serpents, the dragons, appear in Norse archaeology before we find them in Irish or Welsh archaeology, and they appear in early graves, wooden carvings, in boats. Why? Because they're orienting the boat where to go. Okay? Now think of the image of the dragon ship, right? That's probably what you think of when you think of a Viking. Stop thinking of the horns, no horns, no horns. Who's wearing horns? It's a bit of stupidity from Wagner's operas, get that out of your head. No, but I don't know where the horns came from, but they were not very much. Actually, let me tell you, the one example that we know of historically, I know of historically, where horns were worn, ironically, it was in a battle fought in Lithuania. Lithuania being one of the last countries of the Baltic to go Christian. and it was fought actually by some of the last followers of the Norse religion, fighting against Christian armies, and those Christian armies wore horns, representing the evil powers which they were trying to combat and what they thought Norse religion constituted. So the irony is the one time you would have had Norse fighting with horns, they were not the Vikings and they were not the pagans. So that image of the dragon ship goes back to very, very ancient Norse archaeology. And this idea of the ship taking you to your next life, of course, some of you are thinking of the Arthurian legend, right? Shouldn't you be thinking of Morgana Le Fay, who suddenly appears with her two sisters to take Arthur away to Avalon when he's wounded? And now we see the Norse and the Celtic elements really fusing together, because Avalon represents the Isle of Apples. And apples had a very specific meaning associated with eternity in older Norse religion. So suddenly he's going away to the Isle of Eternity, and he's going on a boat. And this idea of the dragon ship is a very powerful one in polytheistic Northern Europe. Where else do we have it? Well, why do you think Thor Heyerdahl called his book Kon-Tiki? So Thor Heyerdahl, when he came to do his research in Peru and Bolivia, freaked out. I have no other way to say this. The first time he was standing on the shores of the world's highest lake, what is it? Lake Titicaca. And he saw the Aymara Indians, and he screamed. It's supposed to be the one time he showed any emotion. It was very kind of dry. What are these Viking boats doing here? Because the Aymara Indians for thousands of years have been using dragon boats on the lake, because they have their own dragon called Kaikaifilu. So you have the Midgard serpent and you have Kaikaifilu, because again these are universal archetypes. Water archetypes. We're getting to the end, so let's start summing up. So is there a difference then between water worshipping and solar worshipping cultures? Can we basically say water worshipping cultures are cool and solar worshipping cultures are yucky? That's not a very academic way of putting it. What I would say is that, and I'll say this, I will agree with Heyerdahl and Rohnholz in their analysis of it, that in terms of political symbolism, worldwide, from about the 5th century on, it does appear that solar elements are more associated with the expansion of empire. But, as Heyerdahl himself pointed out, there is one rather interesting exception to that, and that has to do with where we get the word sun from, because there is an ancient Germanic goddess called Suna, who was a goddess of the sun. It was one of the oldest of the Scandinavian gods. And Suna was associated with fertility and peace. And she sailed the heavens every day in her boat. And so perhaps early solar worship was something very different to what happened when it becomes associated with the male element. Right? So there you go. Problem is men. Issue solved. There you go. But that was the Lady of the Lake. Remember the Lady of the Lake? And you have these women appearing in Welsh and Irish mythology, and they are usually benevolent, but not always. You know what a banshee is, right? Banshee in Irish, right? Women of the wrath. It's called a little hillock. One of the oldest Irish stories talks of the Prince Born, who is having his horse watered by a little lake, and a woman steps out of the lake and she claws him with her nails and drags him down to the bottom of the lake. Not too much fun. The horse wanders back, in some accounts it's a donkey, wanders back to the village and tells the people of this evil woman of the lake who has stolen away Born. What's interesting is that when the people go back to the lake to look for Born, he says, I'm fine, leave me down here. Things are fine with the woman of the lake. Women are usually associated more with the aquatic element, okay? And the aquatic element has to do also with fluid, with giving birth, with everything associated with what is feminine. And so there's fear of it and also respect for it. In the early Arthurian legends, let's stick with the Mabinogeon before the legends get anglicized and frankified, the Lady of the Lake is known by two names. One is Nimue and one is Vivienne. Vivienne is actually the one who bewitches Merlin and leaves him in a cave in Brittany where he is still sleeping and getting younger every year because you know Merlin lives backwards. But she is usually benevolent. What's interesting is that in some of the early Welsh stories, the Lady of the Lake is revealed to be Morgana Le Fay. So Morgana Le Fay becomes now Arthur, or Morgana, or Morrigu, simply as she's called. She has different aspects. She commits incest with Arthur when they are worshipping together in a rite for the god Serunos, the god of stags and deer. So that seems to be a malevolent element, unless you go by the account the Welsh have, that Arthur was the one who forced Morgana to have incestuous relations with him. She is never, however, the evil demon she becomes in the later French and English legends. So forget the stories you may know from Malory's Morte d'Arthur. That's not what she is in the earlier Celtic legends. And if she is the one whose hand comes out of the lake at the end when Sir Bedivere throws the sword in, then, to a certain degree, she, now we go back to the earliest goddesses, is like the vision of Loki's daughter Hel. She is simply the one who takes the souls into the next world, right? Because it's when that sword is tossed, that Arthur is gone. Although, of course, the Celts don't like to get rid of their heroes, and he's supposed to come back, right? And hence the idea of the once and future king. And Welsh mythology has him sleeping under a cave in Caernarfon, and everybody often goes there to look for something nobody wants to see. So, do you know that image? On all of the Celtic and Scandinavian art from the 7th and the 8th century, I don't want to say on all of it, that's an exaggeration, excuse me, on a lot of it, and on a lot of the art that is associated particularly with women and female goddesses, whether it is Hel or Freya among the Norse, whether it is Bridget or the goddess Danan among the Irish, or whether it is Mapone or Epona, the goddesses of the horses among the Welsh and the Irish, they have this image. Anybody know what it's called? You see it right there. Triquetra. Have you ever seen this before? Have you ever seen it on a tattoo? Does anybody have it on a tattoo? It was very common on tattoos. That image exists someplace else. It exists in the Andes, so yes, again, Thor Heyerdahl looked at it and said, what? Amazing. That's a very common image among the Yaoyo Indians of Peru, and it also is all through Central Asia. In Irish cosmology, it represents 3 legs. And I'm going to stick with what we know from the Irish because the Irish have written about it the most. So I'll drag the Welsh and the Norse into this because the Irish give us the most eloquent account of it. One of the legs represents body, one of the legs represents mind, one of the legs represents heart. Okay, so you have heart, you have a separation between heart and mind, which is awfully interesting, and body. Okay, and the idea here is that equilibrium is the strength of the female gods. Now, equilibrium is not always the strength of the male gods. When Thor, it's a very interesting story, when Thor, in an attempt to get that nasty Midgard serpent that's always gnawing at the roots of the world tree, Thor transforms himself in one of the stories into a child. This is very interesting. And he goes out in a boat with somebody else in the boat, and that other person doesn't know he's Thor. And as a child, quote unquote, he's innocently throwing his fisher net into the sea to catch the Midgard serpent. And lo and behold, that really nasty Midgard serpent rears its head, and Thor then retransforms back into the god that he is, and is about to throw his hammer to knock that silly serpent out. And then at the last minute, the other person in the boat cuts the net, and the dragon, or the serpent, or whatever you want to call him, manages to escape, and Thor cannot throw his hammer, and so that darn thing is still gnawing at the roots of the tree. Thor is angry at himself because he did not strike quickly enough. So analysts of these stories, and I'm thinking of a very important anthropologist I would recommend to you. His name is Paul Jackson. If anybody's writing anything down, Paul Jackson at the University of Birmingham, England, not Birmingham, Alabama. Paul Jackson points out that when you look at these stories, what you seem to see is that while equilibrium is recommended for the women, impulsiveness is recommended for the men. But isn't that interesting? Because, no, a lot of anti-female stereotypes in our modern world say women are always over-emotional. You know, it's the man who's always the symbol of calm, and well, ooh, that's interesting. Something to think about. Something very interesting to think about. Okay, so now we go back to the origins, and we see that the origins are extremely mixed. You know, when the Irish say that the second to last invasion of Ireland by the goddess Dana arrived on boats flying in the air. Okay, the people of the goddess Dana arrived on boats flying in the air, and those boats were dragon boats. You're already aware that by the time the Irish are writing this down, and again that's from the Lawer Gebala Éireann, which is written in the late 14th century, there had been such a cultural mixture between the Irish, the Welsh, the Norse, and a tremendous amount of interaction with other people, including Jews in the Mediterranean, including peoples of the New World, certainly for the Norse. And by the way, something you might not know is if you look at reconstructions of what were early Norse houses in the 6th and 7th centuries, you know they look like Indian teepees. And there is a reason for that, because they were meant to kind of replicate the idea of the world tree with the branch sticking up and the roots going into the ground. Well, the Cree and the Iroquois Indians have this idea as well. This is a universal archetype. It's also something that may have made it possible for the Norse to have had much more peaceful relations, I have to say, with the native peoples of these continents than any other bunch of people that came later. That I think we all know. So in Hallstatt, going back, you see this image. This is an image on the cover of a book I would really recommend to you if you want to delve into this. The book is called The Celts. It was written by a great German anthropologist by the name of Gerhard, G-E-R-H-A-R-D, Herm, H-E-R-M. And he was very interested in looking at the multiple cultural relations that are involved in these mythologies. And of course he also has a reason for that. He's writing in Germany after World War II, and he is also very interested in creating a different type of Germany than that which had existed in World War II, and with rescuing the Norse heritage and the original German heritage from what fascism had done with it. And I think there's something very valid in that, because the more you actually look at these stories, the more you see that they are stories of immense cultural interaction. There's nothing culturally homogeneous here. So what are you looking at? You're looking at an image of the god Cernunnos, and the stag in Celtic mythology represents aspiration, ambition, and later on, but I think this may be something that comes in much later, among the Welsh, he will represent also fertility. What does the stag represent in early Irish and early Norse mythology? Interestingly enough, there's no sexual meaning there. He is simply a symbol of duality, hence, look, the two horns. Does that remind you of anything? It should remind you of the idea of the world tree, of coexistence between the worlds of the living and the dead. Gerhard Herm talks about foundational myths, and with that, I think we're going to bring this to a close, because here's where it closes, because what we come down to is one of Thor Heyerdahl's funniest points. He said, the more you travel, the more you're going to see that people are obnoxiously similar everywhere you go. And as Heyerdahl said, if you're trying to idolize any group of people, don't stay with them for more than 2 weeks. Because he was very right. He said, if you stay with them for more than 2 weeks, you will need a bottle of aquavit to deal with them. But what he also pointed out is you should remember that they will need a bottle of aquavit to deal with you. So rather than getting into wild theories of who brought what to whom, yes, there definitely was contact in the ancient world. Heyerdahl proved that himself with the book Kon-Tiki. But as he pointed out as well, there is a similarity that unites all of us as human beings. And that is more of the reason why you will find common motifs in so many of these myths. So, as we end, we see a bit of a summing up of what we spoke about before. We have these 3 pictures together for a reason, because they sum up this connection with the night sky mythology. Woden, whose wisdom, who sacrifices his eye for wisdom, all right, a kind of very martyrological King Solomon, with the 2 ravens of thought and memory. We have, do any of you recognize that? Does anybody recognize that? That's one of the oldest sky calendars in the world. Okay? And it is from very, 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 very ancient Germany. And it represents the positions of the night stars sometime in the 6th century. And this is a time in which in what was then pagan Germany, there was a great deal of contact between the Gothic tribes, the Jews, the Byzantines, and so there was also a tremendous knowledge of astronomy, which will get lost, later on in the Middle Ages. And the muses of Scandinavia. Now I have to say, these 2 images probably look as Scandinavian as I look Japanese, but this also is there to show you the way people will imagine things later on. Because in the 19th century, these mythologies, which are not so easy to take with a 19th century Victorian mentality, are sanitized. I do recommend you to go back to the original myths themselves because, the way Heyerdahl spoke about a messy dialogue, they are messy, but they are infinitely interesting and they show us our shared humanity. And so, Epona and Hel, the goddess of the horse, the goddess of the world of the living and the dead. We come back to this idea of the supernatural female. We know in the Bible, Eve eats the apple before Adam. We have a constant connection between the woman and the supernatural. The woman is often victimized, but the victimized woman also can fight back. So while the goddess Epona will die in one of the races that she is sent into, she will reincarnate herself, and the Irish Celts believe very strongly in reincarnation, and life continues. Although Hel, this poor Hel, I think Hel is looking more scared of human beings than human beings are of her. When you go to Hel, with all the fear you have of going to Hel, the spirit that greets you is a benevolent one. So you do not have to be frightened by, again, that image of her half living and half dead. These are, as Heyerdahl calls them, the human archetypes that help us to explain ourselves to ourselves. This is a bit of a joke between my colleague Kendra and myself. Kendra and I have used this image, and I don't want to tell you how many power rooms. And you have a wonderful Howard Powell Visitor Center here in Phoenix. You know that? It's in Tempe. Howard Powell was a late 19th, early 20th century illustrator who loved this kind of beautifully over-romantic art and was in love with Celtic and Norse legends. And made these archetypes that, let me tell you, we have used that for Aztec goddesses, Welsh goddesses, biblical prophetesses. She is anything you want her to be. So it got to the point that I had asked Kendra to put this picture in so many times. She pointed out to me, we may have a few people who've been to other lectures and somebody's going to raise their hand and say, no. I saw that. So here she is again. She's the catch-all goddess. Okay, but I think she's the final proof of what Thor Heyerdahl said. Universal archetypes, right? The beautiful woman, the femme fatale. And with that, that's ending with a beautiful woman, right? I'm going to end. Thank you very much.